Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. It's really exciting for all of you to be here. I want to welcome you, and I want to thank, first of all, the Walker Institute, the Islamic World Studies program, as well as Religious Studies and the Women's and Gender Studies program for this exciting talk. I would like to, first of all, introduce Dr. Hadia Mubarak. She is an associate professor of religion at Queen's University, Charlotte, so she's not coming from very far to be with us here today. And she teaches courses there on Islam, comparative scriptures, women and gender in the Muslim world, the history of Islam in America, and religious representation in popular culture, among other courses. Dr. Mubarak completed her PhD in Islamic Studies from Georgetown University, where she specialized in modern and classical Quranic exegesis, Islamic feminism, and gender reform in the modern Muslim world. She also currently serves as a scholar in residence with the Muslim Community Center of Charlotte and a board of advisors member with the Carleton Center for the Study of Islam and a scholar with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And her talk today covers themes related to Islam, women, and gender in her book, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Quranic Commentaries, as well as broader issues pertaining to the ways in which Muslim women have historically been the subject of various reforms and commentary in both the Muslim world and in the West. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Mubarak to begin her talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wahid, for that introduction. It's an honor to be here in the University of South Carolina. I think it's my first time at this university. I met a few of you during lunch. I met a few of you in Dr. Noah's class earlier. Hey, we met a few of you. So that's kind of my official bio. Maybe I should say a few things about, also my lived experiences as a Muslim woman. I mentioned this in the class before, so forgive me if it sounds familiar. I was born in New Jersey. My parents are originally from the Middle East, from, I should say, the Arab world. The Middle East is a political language, right? The middle of who's east. So they're from Syria and Jordan. I grew up in the Panhandle, so I was basically 3 years old when my parents left New Jersey to the Panhandle. At a certain point of my life, I decided to wear hijab. Once I did that, obviously, things changed for me. I remember I was only 12 years old when someone down the street from my parents' house asked me, and forgive me for the blunt language, but this is what I was asked as a 12-year-old. I had no idea what it meant. They said, "You F with that on your head." Two teenage boys said that to me. I remember being in high school when one of my classmates, who I ate lunch with every single day, turned to me and once said, "Just whatever you do, don't become a terrorist." And it was these lived experiences that propelled me to eventually do a PhD in Islamic Studies and teach in this field, as difficult as it is, because we've all learned firsthand what it means and what happens when we let stereotypes go unchecked. Dr. Wahid and I were talking about an incident that happened 11 years ago, not too far from where we first met. We first met at Davidson College. Fate had it that was my first job ever teaching in higher ed, was at Davidson College as a visiting professor, and she was a history professor at the time. And right next door to us in Chapel Hill, 3 Muslim college students were murdered in their own home by their next door neighbor, Stephen Craig Hicks. In fact, my husband co-directed the film because we felt so that it was so important for their story to be known. And usually when I ask my students in North Carolina about this incident, very few have ever heard of it. And so the documentary is called 36 Seconds, Portrait of a Hate Crime, because that's all it took for him to do away with the lives of 3 beautiful college students, simply because he hated who they were. He hated their faith. And in fact, when you watch a documentary, one thing you'll discover is that Dia, and he was a homeowner, he was an renter, which either way, he didn't deserve to be killed, even if he was a renter, right? Dia had lived there prior to getting married, but Stephen Craig Hicks left and didn't harass him until his wife, who wears a hijab, moved in with him. And then he began to realize, oh, this guy's a Muslim because his wife wears the hijab. That's when the harassment began. And the reason I start by mentioning this is because gendered Islamophobia is a reality that Muslim women bear the brunt of Islamophobia in this country, which is an exception when it comes to hate crime. Generally, hate crimes affect males more than females. When it comes to Islamophobia in particular, it actually affects Muslim women more than Muslim men. And there's a lot of data to show that. ISPU, which you mentioned, Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, has shown that I think it's something like 70% of women compared to less than 50% of Muslim men have said they've experienced discrimination in public. So there's this cliche of woman in Islam, and I think before we get into this topic, we need to think about what do people mean when they talk about women's status in Islam. You know, what comes to their mind? Are they thinking about religious texts like the Quran, like the prophetic biography, which is a life story of the Prophet? Or instead, are they thinking about the Taliban, an Afghan resistance movement that emerged, not a religious movement, by the way, it is a political movement that emerged in the context of Soviet occupation, right? Russia used to be the USSR, and when they invaded Afghanistan, the Taliban emerged in that context. So when people think of women in Islam, is that what comes to mind? The Taliban's draconian, strict rules against women? Do they think about Saudi Arabia, which is a modern nation state with a very particular culture, a very particular ideological orientation of Islam, if you've heard of the term Wahhabism? Is that what comes to their mind in terms of how women are treated in Islam? Do they think of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which, you know, it's a nation state that has underwent significant regime changes and political upheaval since the 1950s. I really hope that as you are watching the news on what's happening, the tragedy that's happening to Iran right now, and that's happening to the Iranian people, for no other reason than the fact that God chose for them to be born in that country, I hope we're also paying attention to their recent history in the last 50 years, and for us to recognize that we actually intervened a lot in Iran. When I say we, I'm talking, of course, about our government. We propped an authoritarian Shah who was despised by his people because he was, you know, spending so much money in these very indulgent, decadent parties and inviting royalty from all over Europe and showing off his wealth while people in his own country were suffering. And America propped him up. And by the way, he had banned the chador. The chador is what a lot of women wear in Iran, a lot of religious women. He banned it, right? And of course, when Ayatollah Khomeini came in 1979, he then enforced it. So extremism begets extremism. This is something to remember. You know, when you have a policy that's extreme, that takes people's agency and freedom of choice away, you end up oftentimes with a policy that's also extreme. And that's the case also politically, right? When we have a lack of moderation, a lack of a middle ground, what happens is you have this ebb and flow of one end, another end, right? You can think of it also in, this is very true for a lot of conflicts around the world or political movements, right? When you have decades and decades of military occupation and oppression, you end up getting groups that also fight back with also using extreme means sometimes, right? So these are three categories that are often conflated when it comes to Islam. The most important sources when it comes to what does Islam as a religious tradition teach is obviously the Quran, where we're going to spend most of our time today. The reason the Quran is extremely important is because for Muslims it is the last testament to humanity, not the first. It's the last testament to humanity, right? What would be the first or one of the first for Muslims? Any guesses? Yes.
The Torah?
Yes, exactly. So, there, bingo, right? He gets an A for that. So, the Quran actually identifies 5 revelations: the Torah, the Psalms given to David, the scrolls given to Abraham, the Injil, the Gospels given to Jesus, peace be upon him, and the Quran is the 5th. So there is a recognition and a belief in Islam that the Jewish community, the Christian community have divine origins and were given divine revelation from God. Now that doesn't mean that they believe that the Bible as it is today hasn't been redacted, because guess what? Christian and Jewish scholars also believe they've been redacted. We have historical evidence that the texts have been redacted, that they were compiled at a later date, and there may have been historical reasons for it because parts of the manuscript were lost, etc. Right? Now, we're going to focus today on the Quran because whether you're looking at Shia, Sunni, Ismaili, any sect within Islam, there is a consensus that you are reading the words of God when it comes to the Arabic language. Whereas this, you'll find two other sources I mentioned here. The Sunnah is basically the prophetic precedent. What I like to describe it compare it to, when I was in high school, I grew up in the Bible Belt, I think I mentioned that. A lot of my Christian friends would wear a bracelet that said WWJD. Anyway, is that familiar? What does that stand for?
What would Jesus do?
What would Jesus do, right? So that idea of what would Jesus do is the same idea of Sunnah for Muslims. What would Muhammad do? What would Prophet Muhammad have done, right? So that's how I best like to describe the idea of Sunnah, of what's his ideal behavior and practice, which is a model for Muslims. In terms of textual sources, of course we have the biography, but we also have hadith. In contrast to Quran, the hadith, Muslims know that it was compiled later, not in his life, and so unlike the Quran, where there's a consensus that it was preserved, it's authentic, the hadith, on the other hand, there's a whole spectrum of levels of authenticity, all the way from fabricated to, no, we think it's authentic with a very strong probability that the Prophet actually said it. So one of the most rigorous disciplines in Islamic studies is the discipline of hadith. It's very, very difficult one, and it's not one I've specialized in for good reason, because it's actually a difficult one to master. Now, these are Islam's texts. These are the core religious texts. Oftentimes, we confuse these texts with the interpretive tradition, which is how Muslims have historically interpreted these texts, right? So to give you an example, when it comes to Islamic law, it's one thing for us to say, okay, Muslims believe the Quran is the word of God. But what does that actually mean when it comes to inheritance? Someone passes away, does their grandmother inherit? Does their grandfather inherit? How much do they inherit? Well, guess what? They're not spelled out in the Quran. These are things that have to be deduced. Now you're looking at deducing legal rulings in terms of inheritance, marriage, divorce. Also the rituals of Islam. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm assuming a lot of you know about the 5 pillars of the 5 pillars of Islam. Raise a hand. Who knows about the 5 pillars of Islam? Few of you? Okay. So this is how you basically live Islam, right? The 5 pillars, it's very quickly, it's the belief in one God and the acceptance of the prophecy of Muhammad as the final prophet. Second, to pray 5 times a day during specific times of the day. The third is to pay 2.5% of your wealth, not just your income, but that could include real estate, poultry, other things you own, 2.5% annually to those in need. The fourth is to fast during the month of Ramadan. Hopefully you all know about Ramadan, right? We just finished Ramadan. It's based on the lunar calendar, which is a mercy, because that means it moves up the calendar every year, 10 to 11 days. Eventually it'll be December again. Shorter days, cooler days. So again, it's a mercy. And the last pillar is the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which, by the way, is significant because Muslims believe that Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael with his wife Hagar built that Kaaba. So the story that a lot of you may be familiar with from Genesis 21 of Ishmael and Hagar's exile from the Muslim prison was not an exile at all. It was not an abandonment at all. It was actually a story of a new beginning, of divine will or divine intervention, if you will. And right now I'm a sabbatical. I'm trying to write a book called Biblical Women in the Quran. It's taking me much longer than I thought. But this is one of my areas of interest. But Hagar, her portrayal in the Muslim tradition is very, very different than it is in the Hebrew Bible. Although, of course, if you're interested in this, the Hebrew Bible, she's the first woman who sees an angel when the angel comes and speaks to her directly, who gives her the annunciation of her son's birth. In the Bible, Genesis 16, right? Later on, Genesis 21, there's a theme of water going. She finds water, a well of water. That's something that's very significant in the Muslim tradition because this whole spring of Zamzam in Mecca is believed to be divine grace given to her when she was running looking for her sons, for sustenance for her son. By the way, when we go to Mecca, and my husband and son are going soon to perform what's called the minor pilgrimage. There's a major pilgrimage, the Hajj, that's the last pillar. Also the minor pilgrimage called the Umrah, U-M-R-A. That happens all year long. No one's pilgrimage is accepted unless they retrace the footsteps of Hagar. They have to go 7 times between these 2 hills that she ran past to look for sustenance in commemoration of her maternal courage. You know, the kind of woman she is. So she's celebrated. Hagar is not seen as some slave woman. She is celebrated. And I'm not sure how I got there, but you know, bear with me, because this will all come together. But anyway, I guess you guys will find out by the end the topics that get me going, that I feel passionate about. So that's in a nutshell Muslim practice, and then Muslim belief, maybe I'll get to later. But when it comes to any of these fields of interpretive tradition, there is a spectrum of interpretation, and from the very beginning, after the death of the Prophet, there was this recognition that, look, we're not going to figure it all out. This scholar thinks that a woman needs a legal guardian, or her father should be her legal guardian when she gets married. This scholar, Abu Hanifa, said no, she doesn't need one. The Quran allows her to do what she wills with her own finances. She should be able to do what she wills with her own body and enter into whatever contract she wants. So she doesn't need a wali, a guardian to represent her. The other school said no, she does. And that's fine. They were all seen as valid in Islamic law. So there was always this accommodation of a multiplicity of interpretation, right? All realizing that they're trying their best to understand divine intent, but we're never going to fully get it in this world, right? And that's okay, because ultimately you're not judged based on whether or not you got it right or wrong. You're judged based on your effort, that you tried, that you had the right intention, that you had sincerity in trying to please God and trying to worship God. That's what ultimately matters, right? And there's so many traditions from prophetic traditions, hadith, that support that. If I had time, I would go into it, but I want to make sure we get into the main topic. Lived Islam, and I would say that this is the third category that people often, is the lens people are often using to judge Islam, right? Which is, they're not really looking at Islam, they're looking at Muslims, they're looking at nation states, they're looking at potentially history, culture. So I just remembered, Sarah, I had updated my slide. So, but anyway, I had a slide that shows you where Muslims live. There are 1.8 billion Muslims today. That's roughly a fourth of the world's population, right? So for us to assume that you can, reduce a quarter of the world's population to one culture is very naive, right, and reductionist. Almost any country in the world, you will find some Muslims, right? They're the most populated, the state with the largest population of Muslims. Anyone knows? Yes. Indonesia, right? And then somewhere down there is Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria. Most of them are not in the Arab world. Arabs are actually only 20% of Muslims, roughly, right? So they're a minority, not the majority. Also, some Arabs are Christian. Some Arabs are Jews or Zoroastrians or some other faith, Baha'i. So again, that's another stereotype we often have, is we conflate those two categories. The other part of lived Islam, that especially when it comes to women and gender issues, we tend to take the individual stories of a woman, whether it's fictional or non-fictional, and then use that individual story to kind of understand 1.8 billion people's experiences, right? Which is very problematic. So this is, for example, memoirs, books you read. Anyone here read 1,001 Splendid Suns? Couple? I bet you high school? Was it assigned reading in high school? No. Oh, who was it? Was it assigned reading in high school for any of you? 2 of you, yeah. So that's a fictional work, right? But no judgment. How many of you walked away reading that book thinking, I wonder how many Afghan women lived this experience, have this experience? If you remember that, it's like a horrific book. One of my students convinced me to read it. Khalid Hosseini's. He's the same author who wrote The Kite Runner, which is again a very sad book. I mean, again, no judgment, right? Because I have my PhD, I teach on women and gender Islam, I'm reading this thinking, oh my gosh, how many other Afghan women have experienced this, right? And because that's just the way the mind works sometimes, if it's a culture we're unfamiliar with, we go to the closest thing that we can hold on to, right? And in my case, I happen to know someone who was from that country who had a bad marriage, and so you find yourself going into these terrible stereotypes, right, about cultures that are unfamiliar to us, and that's one thing that I always say is we all have our biases, right, and our biases remain in our subconscious until we consciously try to become aware of them. That is the only way we can then move them to consciousness and say, you know what, I have this bias. Where is it coming from? Or maybe it came from this film I watched, Not Without My Daughter. Maybe it came from the book, Thousand Splendid Suns. That's when I see a woman with hijab. I think she's being beat up by, her husband beats her up, right? Maybe that's where I got this idea from. So we all have our biases. That's a normal human tendency, but we need to kind of interrogate those biases and try to become aware of how true is this idea that I have? Where did it come from? So there is no such thing as Islam land. Islam is not a place from which one can come. This is a quote from Dr. Laila Abu Ghazal, one of my favorite authors. Highly, highly recommend this book. It is an academic book, but it's actually very easy to read. I feel like you'll enjoy it. It's called Do Muslim Women Need Saving? So she says Islam land, Islam land, as I would call this mythical place, anoints the call to arms for women with transparent goodness. Islam land enables those who advocate for women's rights to accrue moral capital. She says Islam land is the problem, and Islam is condensed in the figure of the victimized Muslim woman. Interestingly enough, and I think her book was published in 2015, she has a chapter called Going to War for Women. This is relevant today for various reasons. So one thing I'd like you to take out of this lecture is the fact that Muslims are not a monolith. Every country has its particular state policies. There are about 57 countries in the world today that are either Muslim majority or have substantial Muslim populations, 57, right? And then you have obviously many countries that are not Muslim majority that also have substantial Muslim populations, especially in places like Africa, like Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, we'll talk about that in a second. Anyway, there's probably a lot more. So Muslims differ among themselves regarding the parameters of their own faith, even about fundamental questions like, what are the criteria for salvation? What rights do women have in Islam? There is no singular Muslim experience or interpretation of Islam. I'm going to give you a case example. When it comes to women in public office, you have at least 10 Muslim majority countries that have elected women as heads of state. Benazir Bhutto was the first, elected in 1988, right? And she was elected twice. Bangladesh has had 2 female prime ministers. Turkey has had a female prime minister. Indonesia, Kosovo, Senegal, twice. Mali, Kyrgyzstan. You also have countries that are not Muslim majority. Tanzania is one of them, where a Muslim woman is until 2025 was a Muslim woman who also, by the way, happened to wear hijab, was the head of state, right? And I love this picture because Sarkozy here, major Islamophobe, is having to sort of, who really does not like the hijab, show some deference to the president of her own country, right? Or the state leader, I think she was, actually she was the president of, I don't think they have a prime minister. Now, in contrast to what I just shared, you have countries, so you have Sunni Muslim majority countries like Pakistan, where woman was the head of state. You have other Sunni Muslim majority countries like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, where forget about women running for office, they weren't even voting until the 21st century, until decades later after women were running for office in other Muslim majority countries. So Kuwait, 2005, women got the right to vote. In Saudi Arabia, 2015. How can we explain these differences? You have Egypt, Morocco, Jordan that have a quota, so somewhere in the middle they have had a female head of state. So in some cases you're looking at monarchies as well, but they have a quota, they have a certain number of seats reserved for women. So how do we explain these different policies or outcomes? If we're looking at countries that are all Muslim majority, how do we explain these quite drastic differences in some cases. Any thoughts? And I mean, I guess I want to follow that up with another question. I mean, would anyone say that we think religion is a primary factor affecting these policies? That religion is the reason for these different policies? Thoughts? Yeah. So if religion, yes, please.
Was it, religion isn't the cause, but it might be the justification.
Yeah, I mean, well, the question becomes, if religion is the primary factor, how can we explain they're all Muslim majority, right? So there must be something else, right? There must be something else going on. State policy, maybe culture, maybe also the ruling elites and how they interpret women's rights. It's, you know, so Saudi Arabia is a really good example of that. They were very much influenced by Wahhabi Islam, very, very conservative, very literal. Some might say extreme in some cases, especially when it comes to women. So here's the thing. When we always think of Muslims only as religious subjects and only as informed, when we think of a Muslim as someone whose behavior can only be explained by religion, that is actually a racist trope. And I actually want to bring this to our attention, even if we might not mean it, right? When we think of Muslims as people, as human beings that are influenced by nothing else than their religion, that is a problem because we're actually dehumanizing them. We don't realize we're dehumanizing them, right? So two individuals do the exact same thing, exact same thing, might live very parallel lives, but one is Muslim and one is not. All of a sudden, the media frames the behavior of one, tries to explain their behavior through their religion, right? When it comes to the Muslim person. I'm going to give you an example, and I don't remember all the details about it, but around the same time, December 2024, in our country, there were 2 acts of domestic terrorism, one in Las Vegas, one in New Orleans, Louisiana. You know, very, very tragic. It was around Christmas time. I remember both were in the news, days apart. Interestingly, both were former U.S. Army military men. They had been actually both stationed in Afghanistan at a certain point. They both were actually even stationed in the same base, I believe in North Carolina, and both actually committed very similar acts of terror. And one happened to be Muslim and one wasn't. In fact, it was very difficult to even find out the faith of the other guy who happened to be white. The other guy who was Muslim, I think was like black or brown, right? And had a foreign sounding name, but he was born and raised in America. And interestingly, for the first guy who was Muslim, it was all, you know, the media was just fixated on this person's faith and what was it about this person's faith that motivated their violent actions. Whereas for the other person, it was very much like, oh, this person had PTSD, this person was having marriage issues or whatever other issues. It was a humanizing framing, right? And I just bring that to our attention because this happens so frequently that we don't even think about it. Why are we dehumanizing the other person to think that they're not a normal human being, that also maybe have their erratic behaviors because of some psychological issues or some other, just like the other guy had PTSD, I'm sure this guy had PTSD, right? And that's never to justify anyone's behavior. I mean, violence is never justified, whether it's individual acts of violence or state acts, acts of violence. So some common pitfalls that we find in our discussions on Muslim women is that there's a tendency to place all problems related to Muslim women on the doormat of Islam. And second, there tends to be this obsession with the stories of victimized Muslim women, right? The abused Muslim women. Laila Abu Lughad says there's a unique public appetite in the West for narratives about abused Muslim women. In fact, I don't have all the data here. I recommend reading her book, specifically her 3rd chapter called Authorizing Moral Crusades. And she will give you novel after novel, book after book, documentary after documentary, how many times they've had to republish them because of how popular they become about a very horrific story of an abused Muslim woman. That's not to trivialize these stories when they are non-fictional, when they are based on someone's real life. They are as horrific as any act of violence or oppression in our own country. When a woman is raped, when a woman is abducted, when a woman is abused. they're just as horrific. But what we don't get when we read those stories is how much the people in those countries are as horrified as we are in the West when we read them. And the reason I bring this to our attention is because oftentimes these are the stories we're reading in high school, right? Like the two people who, and thank you for sharing that, you read Thousand Splendid Suns, probably assigned reading. You might have read, reading Lolita in Tehran, Kite Runner, not sure what other works. I Am Nujood, Age 10 and Divorced. This was literally, I bought this book once because it was in the airport. It was framed like on the glass of a bookstore. And then you could get it for like Kindle Reader for $0. It's interesting how much these books are really marketed. And then they become, these horrific stories of abuse become the lens through which we understand everyone else's experiences. We think, half of 1.8 billion Muslims are, right? That their experiences are the same as Nujood, that their experiences are as horrific as those two women in the book, Maryam and I don't remember her name. the Thousand Splendid Sons. That every Muslim woman's wife, every Muslim woman's husband is abusive, and that's not a coincidence that we walk away with those ideas, because as Abu Lubad mentions in her book, those stories, even when they are stories of individuals, they are always contextualized by culture, and the placement in these locations marks the abuses as cultural or collective. The bad men who abuse our heroines are Muslim, even if Moroccan, Pakistani, Jordanian, or Yemeni. Dr. Wahid mentioned that I teach a class on Muslims and pop culture, so we do this a lot with films. We analyze films together, from American Sniper, all the way to going back to the early 20th century, 1921 silent film called The Sheikh, this Arab tribal guy who abducts a white American woman and tries to add her to his harem, right? The images we consume about Islam, Muslims, and even Arabs have been quite consistent over the century. It's actually quite surprising. Real Bad Arabs with 2 E's looks at over 900 films and finds that the vast majority of these 900 films about Arabs in specific, but also about Muslims, are vilify them as violent, as perverse, as people you can't trust. And even when the representations of Muslim women slightly change, they're also still very demeaning, right? American Sniper is a perfect example. Anyone here watched American Sniper? Yeah, so who's seen that scene? And even if you haven't seen the film, who's seen the scene of the Iraqi woman wearing all black who gives a grenade to her little son? Who's seen that scene? Okay, so interestingly enough, that scene never happened in, forgetting the soldier's name right now, someone remind me. Chris Kyle's life. He writes a memoir. In his memoir, there's a woman, there's no child. So it was the Clint Eastwood's a figment of his imagination to add a child. And what that does is it dehumanizes Iraqi women by showing that they won't even blink an eye when their own child falls to the ground. What mother would actually be that way? Be so callous to give her son a grenade and then have her son fall right before her eyes and not even blink an eye. And there's a reason Clint Eastwood adds that. It never happened, right? It's to show us how barbaric these people are, why they deserve to be killed, why they deserve to be, why we shouldn't feel sympathy for them when they die, right? That's the real message we're getting. And once you begin to catch on to these representations, you will find them repeated over and over and over again, even no matter how creative or different the film professes to be. I mean, of course, there's some exceptions. And so, again, Not Without My Daughter is a good example. A lot of Americans' understanding of Iran from that time was based on this film, which is a film of one specific woman. And she says in her interview later on, which I always show this interview, the real Betty Mahmoudi, in her interview, she says, I don't want people to walk away from the film thinking all Iranian men were like my abusive husband. She said, actually, the majority of Iranian people were very kind, complete strangers, gave me money, trusted me with money. And they said, don't even worry about paying me back, wait till you get to the American escape. She said, complete strangers helped her and her daughter escape, right? This is what the real Betty Mahmoudi says. But in the film, all you get is like Iranians must be these fanatic, crazy, very harsh, draconian to women, right? And so what I want us to pay attention to is how one person's story suddenly becomes the story of all the women in that country, which is something we never do in our own country, right? Like Ariel Castro, anyone heard of Ariel Castro? The school bus driver in Ohio who had abducted 3 women and they had been in his basement, one of them trapped there for 9 years. Well, we know enough about Ohio to know, like, oh, not all Ohio men are snatching women off the streets, right? Or we don't say, oh, all school bus drivers, watch out now, you never know which one might be like Ariel Castro, because we know enough about our own society. But when it comes to other people's cultures, other societies, we tend to think that one person's story is the story of everyone else in that country, right? And so we need to be very, very careful of these monolithic representations and projecting one person's story on the entire Muslim world of over 57 countries and over 1.8 billion people. I'm going to skip through some of this part, but this is just to show us how far back these ideas about Muslim women stem. And also from art, from images, from postcards, a lot of these, the Sultan's favorite, were based on nothing but the painter's figment of his imagination. Just like Clint Eastwood decides in his film, American Sniper, one of the most profitable films in America, one of the most popular films in America, just like he decides to add something from the figment of his imagination to show Iraqi women and Iraqi moms in this dehumanizing way. Similarly, European painters were painting what they imagined was happening in the so-called harems of the Muslim world through their own imagination without, according to many scholars, without even having had, even though with rare exceptions, they had little or no contact with Muslim women and had never been inside the family quarters of a Muslim home, right? So these ideas of Muslim women as either on one end of the spectrum downtrodden, oppressed, or overly sexualized, these ideas come for a few centuries now. And so it's an uphill battle to climb to try to unlearn these ideas. That's why I think it's so important before we actually just talk about women in the Quran that we are aware of the cognitive biases we have on this subject. And interestingly, there was back then, just as there is now, there was a political objective to these representations. Zachary Lockman, in his book, Contending Visions of the Middle East, says, not surprisingly, the degraded status of Muslim women would later be cited as a justification for European intervention and colonial rules. It was said, just as the Ottoman sultans and other Muslim rulers tyrannized their subjects, so Muslim men were said to tyrannize their wives and daughters. Layla Ahmed also notes how this was again used by colonizers, this rhetoric of Muslim women being oppressed, to legitimate the colonial project. You can't just, as colonizers, you can't just say or admit that you want to plunder their resources, that you want to, subject the people so that you can, extract their resources and benefit. You have to kind of give some moral, right, like reason for why you're doing what you're doing. So of course, the British said, Lord Cromer, right, the British consul in Egypt, he said, we're trying to liberate Egyptian women. By the way, he was against women voting in his own country. He was against women's suffrage in his own country, right? We see the hypocrisy. We have people today, politicians, who want to liberate women in Iran, but are actually against women's rights in their own country here in the United States, right? So we need to pay attention to history because it tends to repeat itself. And I'm going to give you an example from today. You guys can look this up because this person actually said this ludicrous thing that you're going to see this quote. He said, it's hypocritical to say, so you all remember when the girls' school was attacked in Iran, and over 100 Iranian schoolgirls were killed very, very tragically. I can't imagine the pain of those, of the parents of those children. And yet you have someone from our own country coming and saying, it's hypocritical to say that these attacks harmed women and children when those women and children, the young girls that you reference, would live a life in a barbaric, unequal society behind a burqa with no ability to make career choices. So in other words, justifying their death, justifying their attack because they would have supposedly lived behind a burqa. First of all, anyone from Iran here? Iranian women.
She's on her way.
Iranian women have accomplished a lot. There's women in parliament, there's female scholars. In a class earlier, I talked about Islamic feminism. There are a lot of Islamic feminists in Iran who've been able to use religious texts, religious rulings to actually advocate for Muslim women's rights. For example, in divorce, where a woman can get compensation for all the free labor she provided for her husband and kids when at the point of divorce, where they can calculate that and say, you know what, you didn't work outside the house, but you sure as did work inside the house. That was a lot of free, invisible labor. You're going to get compensated for it. These are sort of the kind of legal reforms that Muslim women in Iran were able to advocate for. So I mentioned why we need to confront these stereotypes. So now I want to move on to looking at religious texts. So what does the Quran say about women? I'm not going to get too far into that today. Come in, please. So does the Quran promote egalitarianism or misogyny? Obviously, this is not just a theoretical question. When we think about the fact that Muslims believe this is God's word to the last testament to humanity, it really means something when you say, you know, God says, right? So when you're saying the Quran says, you're essentially saying God says. And so I'm going to look at three different approaches to women in the Quran. There's a scriptural reading, which just tries to look at the scripture outside of the genre of Quranic commentaries. And they're not necessarily trying to be pro or against, or just trying to say, what does the Quran actually say about women and gender? This one is by Celine Ibrahim. It's one of the most recent books on women in the Quran. Highly recommend it. She looks at every single female figure in the Quran, including even an ant in the story of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon. And then you have a second approach, which is basically egalitarian readings of the Quran. In one of your classes, you're reading Amina Wadud, right, where they basically say the Quran is an egalitarian text, and misogynist or patriarchal readings of the Quran have been imposed by human beings on this text. But if we read the text itself, it is an egalitarian one. And then you have this third approach where, you know, there are a lot of scholars. I just have two examples here. And it's a critique of the second approach by saying, you know, perhaps they are being a bit naive. Perhaps they are projecting their own contemporary sensibilities of justice, of gender justice, gender equality on an ancient text, on a 7th century text in a way that's anachronistic, that doesn't really fit. Now, what I do in my book is that I argue that we need a new approach, one that engages with the long history of the Quran's interpretive tradition, and that points a way out of this deadlock that exists between specifically the second and third approaches. And this is where my book intervenes. One thing I'll mention about most of these approaches is that they're not engaging with Quranic commentaries, with this genre we call tafsir, right? They're saying a lot of things about tafsir without actually substantively engaging with it. And so this is where I try to bridge the field of women's studies and tafsir studies by actually substantively engaging with about 7 pre-modern books of tafsir, of commentaries, with 3 pre-modern ones, 3 modern ones, but they have 4 authors, because one is co-authored. And rather than pit a seemingly egalitarian Quran against an allegedly patriarchal tafsir tradition, exegetical tradition, I try to understand what is tafsir, what does it say about women in the context of its own genre and in light of its historical development. I will say one of my mentors in this field, who was the first Western scholar to write about women in tafsir, is actually Barbara Stowasser. She was the person I studied with at Georgetown University. She passed away, unfortunately, while I was writing my dissertation, so she never got to see the end of my dissertation. The book is an outgrowth of that. I mentioned her in my acknowledgments. And so why is this important? I argue it's important because the pluralism of this tafsir tradition offers a gateway for new interpretations. Ones that don't presume patriarchy as an inherent feature of the Quran. Second, by engaging with tafsir, we have a clear understanding of its inner mechanics, of how tafsir, how Quranic exegesis actually works. And what I argue is that a closer analysis of this discipline will enrich contemporary efforts to recover Islam's broader ethics, including gender egalitarianism. And so in contrast to some of these other approaches I mentioned, where they just kind of dismiss the whole exegetical tradition a priori, as they called it, consistently monolithic, or consistently monolithically patriarchal. That was one author's description. Or, you know, it's all very traditional. I argue let's actually look at these works. What we find, again, is that there is a spectrum of interpretation. So I'm going to actually give you today, and I'll try to end soon so we can have time for Q&A. I'm going to give you one case example. My book looks at four verses, gendered verses, and I compare 7 pre-modern exegeses with 3 modern ones, but these 3 are, again, one of them is co-authors, so we're looking at 4 exegetes. So just really quickly, and what I'm examining is the intersection of modernity and Sunni thought on women. I also situate these 3 influential Sunni Quranic commentators in their historical context of 20th century North Africa, paying close attention to the intellectual encounters and historical developments that precipitate some of their interpretations on women, what was going on in their own context. So, all 3 of these are significant for various reasons. The first one is an Islamic modernist tafsir. It's considered the first modernist tafsir. I'm not going to get into the details of how it's different, why it's different, just know it's important. But you can definitely do more research on it. The second one is one of the most widely translated Quranic exegesis, globally speaking. It was written by an Islamist who was first a literary critic, and then he was secular early on in his career, and becomes an Islamist, and he's eventually executed by the Egyptian Nasser regime in 1966 because of his political views. And then the third one I look at is by a 20th century, what I call neo-traditionalist. So you have a modernist approach, you have an Islamist approach, and then you have a neo-traditionalist approach. And I also argue that the neo-traditionalist hasn't been examined as closely as the reformist / modernist or the Islamist, because there was just a fascination in Western literature with the former 2 approaches. But the neo-traditionalist anchors their authority in the tradition while also trying to be a corrective to that tradition. So actually I have an article, if you're interested, in the Journal of Quranic Studies called Change Through Continuity, looking at specifically his tafsir, his interpretation of 434. I'm not going to get to 434 today, but one thing I try to do in the book is I also try to situate them in their historical context. So I look at how, through the medium of their commentary, they're not only engaging with the Quran, they're also engaging with things happening in their contemporaneous context, right? So what's going on in their context? First and foremost, you have colonialism, right? Specifically with the first 2, Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abdo. Muhammad Abdo was literally overlapping with Lord Cromer, who's saying things like Islam is the greatest obstacle to women's progress, right? Writing things, he wrote, Lord Cromer, who was basically the British ruler of Egypt at the time that Muhammad Abdo was doing his exegesis, is saying things like, the fair-skinned Christian European man, literally I'm quoting, he says, is loyal to his wife because of his Christianity, whereas he will say the dark-skinned Egyptian man will throw off, he says something like, take her off like a sock and remarry, as if every Egyptian man is a polygamist, is polygamous. So, and this was the person who's leading Egypt. So you had, during the time of the first exegesis, they are refuting a lot of colonial critiques on Islamic gender. And so what I found is that there's the emergence of what I call a gender-conscious hermeneutics in the modern era, whereas pre-modern scholars, they didn't really care about trying to prove that women have rights in Islam or trying to prove that the Quran supports equality, musawa. Now in the modern period, there's an emphasis on some of these verses because they are responding to things happening in their context, and because they understand it's not just ideological, it's political. because you're in a situation where new modern nation states are being developed, and there's a question as to Islam's relevance and compatibility with modernity. And the issue of women becomes a litmus test of that. And they realize it, these scholars realize that the question of Islam's treatment of women is being used as a litmus test, and so they're responding to it. And we see it very, very clearly in their commentaries. So Muhammad Abdo, he more than any other exegete during his time, tries to offset Western charges against Islam's treatment of women. He basically says, listen, you guys are confusing Muslim behavior with Islam. And it's interesting, it's a very simple but very true argument, and something that's still very relevant today. You know, we see something a Muslim man does somewhere in the world, and we assume he somehow represents all the men in his faith, right? And please let me know how I'm doing on time.
Oh,
okay,
yes.
Yes.
Like 5 more minutes.
Okay. So Rashid Rida, who co-authors Al-Manar, on the other hand, is sort of defensive. He writes a whole book on the subject of women called The Rights of Women in Islam and Their Fortune in the Universal Muhammadan Reform, published in 1932. By the way, you wouldn't find titles like these early on. Not that you wouldn't find books devoted to women or subject of women. The class I attended earlier, female scholars, have always been a very rich tradition of female scholars in Islam. But the fact that now Muslim scholars are going out of their way to profess and demonstrate Muslim women's rights was initially a reaction to some of the charges against Islam that came from colonizers, whether it was the French in Algeria, the British in what was, you know, British Palestine, in places like North Africa, Jordan, etc. The second tafsir or commentary is actually coming later on in the 20th century, and he is responding to indigenous, secular, liberal, and feminist discourses on women. And with every single one of these commentaries, I find that they challenge the dominant interpretation on at least one of the verses of the 4 I look at. So again, showing that tafsir, meaning again, the genre of exegesis, was never monolithic. And he's basically trying to argue, you know, why do you need feminism when Islam gives you all these rights, right? And then he goes off on, you know, look at how the French treat their women, and you know, so it's really interesting how their commentary on the Quran becomes a medium to respond to things happening in their own societies. Ibn Ashur is really interesting because, as I mentioned, he's not actually trying to respond to a particular audience. Instead, he's trying to respond to the tradition itself, right? And he is what's considered the foremost Maliki scholar in Tunisia, which is a legal school in North Africa, and he is actually critiquing certain aspects of Maliki law. Here's one example, right? Where he says, hey, the Quran says there is mumathala, parity or reciprocity between men and women, yet there are legal rulings that deprive women of that reciprocity. So in conclusion, you know, I mentioned number one that they are influenced by their contemporaneous context, that there's sort of a dialectic happening. Let's get over that slide. Let me make sure I have it here. Yes. So Quranic commentaries often function as a dialectic reflecting the intellectual priorities of their period. That's number one. And second conclusion is that tafsir, again, Quranic exegesis, embraces interpretive pluralism. There's always been a multiplicity of interpretation, even from the pre-modern period, right? I wish I had more time to give you some examples, but there are plenty of examples, and if you read the book, you'll find some of those examples, right? Actually, very quickly, I will mention one, because this is one of the passages that is grossly misunderstood among Muslims, especially, that says women have rights, like the rights against them, and men have a degree above them. Now, you read this and you're like, degree, is this saying men are superior to women? But actually, one of the earliest, foremost authorities on the Quran was the Prophet's own cousin. His name was Abdullah ibn Abbas, and he says, this is that men have to pardon their wife. A man should pardon his wife if she cannot fulfill all of her responsibilities, but this degree means he should still fulfill his responsibilities to her. It's a degree of responsibility, not a degree of privilege. And literally, if you read the translation of this verse, it's verse 228, you'll find one translator saying a degree of rights, and the other one says, or maybe privilege, and the other one says in brackets, the other one says a degree of responsibility. It's Khattab, Mustafa Khattab, and Abdul Halim. Two very, you're right, which one is it? Degree of privilege, degree of right, of responsibility? Well, it depends on which interpretation you look at, but we have some of the earliest interpretations having more egalitarian readings than later interpretations. So while modern interpretations did not radically subvert some assumptions about men and women, they certainly did push back against some patriarchal interpretations that dominated pre-modern exegesis. And this creates, I argue, new sites of engagement for Muslims who refuse to concede tradition and egalitarianism as mutually exclusive pursuits. That you can have both. You can have your cake and eat it too, right? And there's, I had a case example, but you can read it, later. I mean, interestingly, the Quran uses the same word, nushuz, to describe men's, when men are the cause of marital turbulence. And in another verse, it uses the same word to describe when women are the source of marital turbulence or discord. And yet, in the tafsir, you find that they have very gendered interpretations of the same exact word, where they think women's nushuz is different than men's nushuz. So that's why in my book, I actually have a whole chapter on men's nushuz. And even Muslims look at me and say, oh, we didn't even know the Quran talks about men's nushuz. Nushuz is sort of, it's when people are acting up, let's just say that. Because there's no consensus on what it means, right? I mean, you can see it here, right? It means different things, this word. And they tell me, we only hear about women's nushuz when women are acting up, not when men are acting up. And so the third conclusion I want to end with, and so this was like an example of one of these modern exegetes really kind of correcting the narrative on what nushuz means and basically saying it's the same thing for men and women. It's when they hate the other, when a wife hates her husband or her husband hates the wife. And it's the same thing, it's not gendered, and it doesn't simply mean being angry with each other or disobeying each other, because that's how some exegetes understood women's nushuz. That's where the title of the book comes from. The title of the book, Rebellious Wives, comes from this idea of women's nushuz versus men's nushuz. And he says it's the same thing. And this interpretation of nushuz as hate seems inherently to open the possibility of a gender-neutral interpretation, since hatred is not by definition hierarchical. Aisha Chowdhury writes in her book. And in the conclusion, I want to mention that what I found, that all of these three books of exegesis are very popular. They're all considered very authoritative, and yet they're challenging. They're not just repeating what the predecessors said. And I actually push back in my book on certain arguments that are made, I believe wrongly made, that this whole genre of tafsir is simply repeating things, and that one author had argued that change comes by, I'm trying to remember, that they might change the methods, but they repeat the same conclusions, right? And that's actually what, my data shows something else. It shows that they actually do challenge prevailing assumptions, they do push back, but the way they build interpretive authority is by actually using recognizable methods of interpretation, even if they come with very, very different conclusions. So in conclusion, let me see if I can end it. So Muslim commentators of the Quran, they view the project of Quranic interpretation as a springboard into an endless ocean of meaning. The vastness and depth of the exegetical tradition was a byproduct of the perceived timelessness of the Quran itself. And it was particularly their belief in the Quran's divine ontology, meaning the belief that it comes from God, that opened rather than restricted the possibilities of interpretation. Why? Because no exegete could ever claim finality to his or her interpretation. This is why they end their works with this phrase in Arabic, Allahu Alam, and God knows best. So the genre of Quranic exegesis created an open discursive space for the continual accretion of meaning. So when exegetes embarked on the journey of writing a multi-volume commentary of the Quran, they recognized that the existing corpus of Quranic commentaries had not captured everything there is to know about the Quran. This is partially because knowledge was not viewed as the only prerequisite for understanding divine intent, but also having spiritual insight, known as basira, was also a prerequisite. So the validity and requisite of spiritual experience created a timeless horizon against which the Quran's readers seek its signs and discover its deeper meanings. This invitation for continual reflection comes from the Quran itself. It says, a scripture that we sent down to you, blessed that they may ponder its signs. So the capacity to bring new meanings to bear on the Quran is not only intellectual viable, but inherent to the exegetical tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mubarak. I'd like to open that up for Q&A. So if there are any questions or you'd like to ask.
And if you don't ask me, I'll ask you questions. Questions. It doesn't have to be strictly based on what I just talked about. It could be anything on your mind related to the subject of Islam and Muslims, the Quran. So yes.
I'm gonna ask this. I was trying to look up the reference, but you mentioned about the portrayal of like women in film and such. And I'm trying to think back to Howard Zinn's book, either The People's History of the World or People's History of the United States, where indigenous people were portrayed as naked, and like images were drawn of them like that.
Uncivilized.
Uncivilized, right. And pictures were shown to Europeans, and especially European women, to make them make them think of people as inferior because they were like, oh, look at what heathenistic people they are, they don't have clothes or whatnot. But do you find that like a similar vein where like an image is portrayed, and a lot of times the women in a different society would view women that are stigmatized in this society?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we see this today even in our own context, right? I mean, the way the very stubborn stereotypes that still exist about the hijab, right? And not paying attention to the fact that, well, there's Mary, the mother of Christ, right? The most celebrated, revered woman in Christianity. I mean, how is she dressed? She's often portrayed with a hijab, right? And so the irony just isn't really, I think, obvious, but I think clearly, I mean, portrayals of Muslim women historically and until today are used also to mobilize European women, Western women, you know, to, you know, really against them. I mean, they think they're being mobilized to liberate them, but when you take away someone's agency and choice to choose, you're not liberating them, you're forcing your own sensibilities on them, right? And we saw this a lot after the first removal of the Taliban in 2001, 2002, where it was like, oh, why are these women still holding on to their burqas? Or why are they still holding on to their hijabs? We thought we liberated them, right? And Laila Abu Lughad addresses this in her book because she says, you know, I mean, do you think American women would just suddenly want to change the way they dress overnight because of some regime change? We've had Democrats, Republicans, that's almost sometimes feels like a whole different regime, right? And that doesn't change, right? Like whatever the government decrees we can or can't, people still have their own cultural sensibilities of what they deem to be appropriate for certain contexts, for certain settings, for certain people. And also, I mean, we have a fun time in my class when we do this, you know, we talk about like clothing in America and like what considerations people like think about when they decide what clothes to put on their bodies, right? Very simple question. Like before you walk out of your house, like what do you think about before you put on what you wear? And oftentimes it's like, okay, who I'm meeting? Is it a job interview? Am I gonna go meet my grandparents? Because they tell me if it's my grandparents, I'm gonna dress more conservatively. Is it a date? Is it a sports, right? And but we also have very gendered forms of clothing, even what's like available in the marketplace, right? Like women's dress clothes versus men's dress clothes, you know, and pantsuits is a new thing still, but you know, what's appropriate for men to wear in professional settings versus women. So for us to think that only Muslims have some sort of gendered clothing is just inaccurate. You know, we have the same thing. I still remember, I grew up in a beach town, believe it or not, Panama City, Florida, and my friend looks at me, and she's Christian, and she says, you're lucky because I don't want to wear a swimsuit to the beach, but I would rather just be like kind of like wear trunks and t-shirt. But as a woman at that time, this was like before 2000, she felt pressured as a female that she has to wear a swimsuit to the beach, either a one piece or two piece. That's your only option, right? If you were wearing shorts or a t-shirt like the guys do, that made you seem like you're not feminine, you know. So yeah, we have gendered clothing. I don't know if that really answers your question though. Any other questions?
I don't know if you mentioned this because I came in late, but I sometimes read that Muhammad had, you know, very egalitarian sounding kinds of things going on with his own daughters and his family. Is that how you read texts?
Yeah, I mean, I wish, you know, that in itself could be a semester-long course of how the Prophet, peace be upon him, treated women in his own community. First of all, we know that women also performed the hijrah, the migration from Mecca to Medina, which today by car it's 4 hours, imagine by foot or camel. That was a political act because you are basically now becoming part of a new political entity. And they did what was called the bay'ah, the Pledge of Allegiance, which is a political institution, and meaning that women were politically involved. And in fact, the wording for that pledge, the bay'ah, is in Surah Al-Mumtahina. That's a name of a chapter in the Quran. I don't know what surah number. It's actually in the feminine. It's actually for the women because the Prophet didn't know what to do when the women migrated on their own. And there was, you know, some political things happening between the Quraysh and Mecca and Medina. So the God affirms in the Quran, accept their pledge, their political act of joining your community, even when they're coming alone. Some women came on their own, right, because they were declaring their faith in Prophet Muhammad as a continuation of the Abrahamic faith, bringing the monotheism back to Arabia, because again, what was it called? Arabia is called Hijaz, right? Because as I mentioned, the founding of that city was monotheistic from the time of Abraham and his wife Hagar. So they saw the Prophet as continuing the Abrahamic legacy of bringing monotheism back, and some of them rejected their own fathers, their own husbands, and joined Medina. We find the Prophet's practice in his mosque that there was no barrier between the men and women. They both prayed in the same space. The women behind the men for logistical reasons, but in the same space. They weren't sealed off to some other space where they couldn't be seen or heard. That he would ask questions to the men and the women, that he would educate the men and the women, and that he said education was a religious obligation for men and women. And in fact, his wife Aisha was considered a source of religious authority for the men, that he even told the men to learn their religion from Aisha. That is why if you open books of exegesis or even of Islamic law, you'll find that certain practices come from hadith from the Prophet's wife Aisha. Like that is how we know this is what you should be doing. I should say in the Sunni tradition, obviously, right? In the Shia exegetical tradition or law, in Jafri school, they might have other hadith as well and other sources of authority. But Aisha was seen as the source of authority for the caliphs that came after her. And she was a female, so he established a precedent of female scholars. I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, but there's like something like a 30-volume book that recently is being translated. I'll just write the title for you. It's called Al-Muhaddithat, and the translator is in the UK. And it captures something like in the thousands and thousands of female scholars in the history of Islam, with their biographies and everything. It's a multi-volume work because of how many female scholars there are. And this is something we've lost, unfortunately, in the Muslim world. Due to patriarchy, okay, so these don't work. It's called Al-Muhaddithat. Oh, thanks. Al-Muhaddithat, remember his name?
I don't, but I know the
it's,
volume you're referring to.
It starts with an N, right?
Yes.
Yes, Nedvi.
Nedvi. Yes.
Nedvi, yeah.
There's a summary of those volumes, by the way, that I have, like, you can buy the
Okay.
short version.
Oh, wow, yeah, and so it's like thousands, and it's a book he's translated, he hasn't necessarily, I mean, it's like a biographical dictionary of female scholars, and we're handing out by Dr. Akram Nedvi. Is it with a V, right, or with a W? Do you know? W. Yeah, so,
Muhammad Akram.
Muhammad Akram, yeah. So, this is something we lost in our community, unfortunately. I think because of patriarchy, because of culture. There is a lot of ignorance, even in Muslim communities, about the rights Muslim women have. That's one reason I feel very passionate about this. That's one reason I engage in this, is because I think Muslim men and Muslim women need to first and foremost be educated about the rights that the Quran gives to women, the rights that the Prophet established for women. Unfortunately, not all those rights are being upheld until today. From the rights to inheritance, the right for a marital dower when they get married, the right to financial autonomy, that her money is her money. These are all things that were established in 7th century Arabia that are still not being upheld today by Muslim communities, and also because of a flawed understanding of Sunnah. Again, what would Jesus do, right? What would Muhammad do? A flawed understanding of Sunnah, that they focus on, I think sometimes on the wrong things, right? And ignore other things. As an example, Aisha tells us, the Prophet's wife, that the Prophet was in the service of his family, that he washed his own clothes and knead his own bread. And yet today, you find religious Muslim men who don't even pick up their own plate, right? But they think it's sunnah, right? The prophetic example, to go pray in the mosque or grow a beard. Guess what? It's as much a sunnah to help in with housework. That's as much a sunnah, because that's the prophetic precedent as well. So again, a lot of it has to do with culture, and just trying to untangle culture from religion, and trying to understand these ideas. That's culture. That has nothing to do with Islam. And it's going to be a difficult fight for Muslim women, but the more and more they are educated about their faith and have religious literacy, the more they can try to recover some of those rights, I think. Other thoughts? Yes.
Thank you so much. I have a question about, like, how much do you think, like, this whole discussion is limited by, I mean it in a broad sense, by the brackets or frameworks of law, in the sense that law becomes such a canonical way of relating to religion much more recently, right? Historically, Sharia is not, I mean, there are other modes of engaging with religion. I mean, Quran is not a legal text, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's very few legal edicts, and it's essentially a spiritual text about the soul, which is not gendered, and about the self, which is not gendered. And but most of the discussions about rights, of course, thanks to the frameworks we live in of the nation state, are within the ambit, and of course the tafsir discussions that we have all been that you were elucidating. So I'm wondering, like, if there is a way out of this quandary by actually, I mean, you know, rather than invoking the law, but and if there has been traditions, I mean, both in pre-colonial, pre-modern times and modern times, of sort of engaging the idea from a very different perspective, where law is part of it, but it's a much more holistic view of what it means to be a human, and that lays the foundation of the rights or equality or whatever it comes later.
I think that's a really important point, and I don't know if it makes some time about rights, but I know Layla Abdullah talks about also like the power of the word rights, but I think that's a really important point about why this fixation on Islamic law in Muslim communities, and that is part of the shortcoming, because more important than law was ethics, and that came from other genres, like the genre of zuhud. So what it meant to live an ascetic life where you're really focused on the afterlife and not on the materialistic world. And this became more and more important as the Muslim empire grew and became wealthier. And there were some Muslims who felt like, look, this decadence and opulence we're seeing is not part of the the simpler lifestyle of the Prophet and his early followers, the companions of the Prophet, that it was really more simplistic, and so living deliberately a life with lesser means, like that's a deliberate choice, right? And I always think of the Prophet as the first environmentalist, by the way, because a man comes to him and he says, the Prophet tells him, "La tusrif fil ma," do not waste water. And the man's at a running river. He says, even with a running river, and he says, I don't want to misquote, but something like, only use what you need, right? And I'm like, that's like basically the essence of conservation. It was like, don't use more than you need, right? But to go back to this idea that, you know, like, what is Islam, right? I think that's like the broader question. Islam is not just law, right? It's not just fiqh, like jurisprudence, not just legal rulings. And when we reduce Islam to that, we take away the spirit of Islam, right? Which is the spirit of Islam is trying to connect with the divine, is recognizing our ultimate return. وَإِنَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ رُجْعَى, and to God is your return. That is the ultimate meaning of Islam, right? And Islam means submission. A Muslim is one who submits to that divine reality, that life is fleeting, right? It's not a question of if, it's a question of when do we return. If you're living your life with God consciousness, recognizing that you will stand before your Creator, then, you know, you can, you know, I don't want to get into like controversial ground, but salvation in Islam is actually very, very broad, very, very inclusive. If you look at verse, I think it's 262, and another one, verse 567. Don't quote me on the numbers. The Quran says, whoever believes in God in the last day and does good works, there shall be no fear upon them, nor shall they grieve. And actually, in those two verses, it says, from the believers, meaning those who believed in this Quran. And then it says, among the Jews and the Christians and the Sabians, whoever believes in God in the last day and does good works, they shall not grieve, right? And that's very, in my perspective, that's very ecumenical, right? Like, you're opening the doors of salvation. Now, I mean, other Muslims may disagree with me and say, oh, that meant the early Christians, that meant the early Jews. I will say one thing, by the way, that, and I may have said it before, and I want to kind of also end with this, is that in Islam, you know, the people of the book, Christians and Jews, in the Quran actually have an elevated status, that they're not, the word infidel or the word kafir or mushrik is never in reference to Christians or Jews. And that is a very, very major misconception. People read a passage from the Quran and they think it means anyone who's not Muslim. It's actually oftentimes referencing the polytheists or the pagans of Quraysh who were attacking the Prophet, right? Not just because they were pagan or they were polytheists. They were not giving Muslims the freedom to peacefully practice their faith. They were persecuting them. So when we read the Quran, we have to be very, very aware of that historical context. In contrast, Christians and Jews are often called people of the book, and that's how they're referenced in the Quran. But yeah, I mean, I think your point is correct. And a good book that came out recently, for those of you who are interested, is called Wives and Work by Marian Katz, K-A-T-Z. And she talks about how the same scholar in his book of law will approach the topic differently in another book on, let's say, adab, which is like manners or morals, because law was more about what are you entitled to in a court of law. So it's like kind of the bare basic, the skeleton, right, of like what makes a marriage legal, like what, you know, if a wife went to complain against her husband in a court of law, what is she entitled to, what is he entitled to? What would make the marriage defective and allow a judge to come and annul it? By the way, the legal schools differed on that. In one legal school, if he wasn't providing for her financially, she could get her marriage annulled. In another legal school, that was not sufficient. But the pluralism, the different opinions, allowed women to navigate the courts in a smart, strategic way, historically. That's something that was lost with modernity because of colonialism, where the Europeans said, no, we need, with a nation state, you have to codify the law. You have the notion of citizenship. Everyone's equal before the law, so you have to have one law applied to all. So these new Muslim rulers, new rulers in the Muslim states said, okay, I guess we have to pick one opinion out of all these different opinions. So actually, Islamic law became much less fair to women, much less flexible to women in the modern period. And a lot of it has to do with colonialism, and that's something we don't understand or realize today. Whereas historically, they could go to these different judges and get a ruling that was more preferable to them. A good book that shows this is In the House of the Law by Judith Tucker, who was also one of my mentors and professors at Georgetown. Anyway, I think we're probably out of time.
Yeah,
right?
we're
Did
getting
you have
towards the end
anything
of
else?
time.
Oh, okay, okay.
Thank you so much for being here and